All right, we're going to get started.
Later.
Yes, please. It doesn't matter. Kick the doorstop anyway. Thank you. All right, so what I want to talk about tonight is the question of halacha. And I would say that often when people are talking about theology, we often don't include the question of halacha and its nature and its binding authority. But I think it's really important because, well, you'll see. All right. So the word halacha, okay, the word halacha comes from the shorish haloch, to walk. So it means the path or the way we go. Okay, and many religions use that term. I mean, Tao also means path. Okay, and by the way, so does Sharia. Okay, and
means pain in Vietnamese.
Okay. So interestingly enough, Maimonides wrote his philosophical works in Arabic, and the Arabic word that he used to translate the Hebrew word Torah is Sharia. Okay, so maybe Sharia isn't quite as alien to us as some people would want us to think. But where does it come from? Okay, so Pirkei Avot, okay, which personally I think that the role of Pirkei Avot, which is this book in the Mishnah, right, which is the only book that's sort of non-legal, right? It's ethical aphorisms and so on and so forth. But this is how it begins. Moses received the Torah from Sinai and transmitted it to Joshua. Joshua to the elders to the prophets, and the prophets handed it down to the men of the great assembly. They said three things: be deliberate in judgment, raise up many disciples, and make a fence around the Torah. Okay, so it's a preamble. Okay, it establishes rabbinic authority as part of the chain of tradition, right? I mean, and that's the phrase that we use, shalshelet ha-Kabbalah, the chain of tradition, but Kabbalah in the sense of authority, like received authority, right? And so, who was the first rabbi, according to Avot? Moses. Who ordained him? God, right? And then who was the second rabbi? Joshua. Who ordained him? Moses, right? And it's the same, by the way. I mean, in Christianity, you have apostolic succession, right? I mean, Jesus ordained the 12 disciples, and anyone who's a bishop has to be an apostolic succession to somebody going all the way back to the 12 disciples, at least mythically, right? So the halacha is what is known in rabbinic parlance as the oral law, right? I mean, there are two laws, right? There's the Torah Shebechtav, the written law, and the Torah Sheba'al Peh, the oral law, okay? Now, so if you were to go up there and get one of those Steinsaltz Talmuds, that's a book of oral law. And you say, wait a second. If it's oral law, what's it doing in a book, right? And the answer, I mean, first of all, I mean, you could say it's a term of art to distinguish it from, there's the Torah and there's rabbinic law, right? But also, originally, the oral law was not meant to be written down. Okay, it was not meant to be written down But it was an emergency measure to write it down during the Roman persecutions in Eretz Yisrael. Okay, so the first work of oral law, the first written work of oral law, is the Mishnah, okay, which was codified around the year 200 of the Common Era in Yavne, which is on the coast near Tel Aviv, but under Roman occupation. And the fear was, in other words, what made you a rabbi at that point was that you knew the oral law. You knew it and you could pass it on. And there was a real fear that due to the Roman persecutions, everyone who knew the oral law would be killed and it would be lost. So Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai issued an emergency decree saying we have to write it down. Okay, and that is what became the Mishnah.
And roughly 200?
200 of the Common Era.
And they were able to write,
it's a codification of much older material, but it's much older material that was passed on orally that wasn't written down. Okay, but
was the organization passed down orally too?
Yeah, the organization, exactly, and that is the whole real point of it. In other words, if somebody comes to me and they want to know, well, how do I observe Shabbat? Well, you tell them, well, open up the Bible and go to the book of Shabbat. No, there is no book of Shabbat, right? It's all over the place, right? Moreover, many of the things that we do are not in the Torah, right? Where in the Torah does it tell you to light Shabbos candles, right? As an example, right? So the Mishnah provides all of that material in a codified form, right? If you want to know about the laws of Shabbat, you go to Tractate Shabbat, right? You want to know how to slaughter an animal properly, you go to Hulin. You want to know how to observe Rosh Hashanah, you go to Rosh Hashanah, etc. It's all tractates. So it's very, very clear how to find the material that you're looking for. Okay? And then what happened is the Mishnah became the central study text in the yeshivas, right? And so out of that developed the Gemara, okay, which very hard to explain exactly what the Gemara is, and I'm not going to attempt to do it in this class. But the best way to explain it is if somebody had sat in the classroom of a great professor over the years and written down their lecture notes. Okay, it's an idealized lecture for discussion because you can find in the Gemara, which lays out the argument, two different rabbis arguing with each other, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And then you go to the back of the book and you open up your guide and you discover that these two rabbis lived 300 years apart, and one of them lived in Israel, and one of them lived in Babylonia. Right? So they obviously weren't physically arguing with each other, but the Gemara reconstructed the argument that they would have had based on the positions they were known to have.
And the Talmud is Mishnah?
The Talmud is the Mishnah and the Gemara.
And the Gemara.
Right, it's both of them together.
And are they identified as such?
Yes, absolutely. All right, but you can have this much Mishnah and then pages and pages of Gemara. Okay, also because it's stream of consciousness, right? Like as an example, like the classic example that I would cite is all of the laws of Hanukkah are in Tractate Shabbat. Okay, and you say, well, but what's the connection? Candles, right? And so that's exactly what happens. So they're discussing what materials may be used for Shabbat candles. Okay, and so they say, well, while we're talking about candles, what materials for Hanukkah candles? Okay, and now since we're talking about Hanukkah, let's talk about the rest of the laws of Hanukkah. Okay, and then they exhaust that for several pages, and boom, go back to Shabbat. Okay, but so it's really is very, very stream of consciousness. All right, so then this became codified in the Gemara. Not sure exactly when. Let's say sometime between the 5th and 7th century. And then there are two other forms of halachic literature that developed subsequent to that. One is the responsa literature, right, where somebody has a question and they send the question to some rabbi somewhere else, right? It could be a layperson who asked the question, or it could be another rabbi. I mean, and the responsa literature is still very much a live thing. I mean,
but predated conservative movement itself.
Absolutely, for sure.
But we still do it.
But we still do it, sure. And I mean, I have written responsa myself, and I have also turned to rabbis who are smarter than me for responsa, right? I mean, if I have a question that I don't feel competent enough to resolve, there are rabbis that I go to, right? They might not necessarily always write a formal responsum, but there are rabbis that I go to, and the way the system works is you essentially can shop for a venue, but you can't shop for an answer. In other words, let's say I have, right, somebody comes to me with a question of, with a question, doesn't matter, right? But the two rabbis that I tend to go to are Joel Roth and Elliot Dorff.
And they're here in the United States.
Yeah. Although it doesn't necessarily have to be, right? So, I am looking for a way to say yes to this person, right? But I'm not confident enough in my own knowledge, wisdom, whatever, to simply say yes. I say, well, I'm going to ask Rabbi Dorff, right? Because Rabbi Dorff tends to be more lenient than Rabbi Ross. I can certainly do that. I can choose Rabbi Dorff. If Rabbi Dorff doesn't give me the answer that I want, I can't go to somebody else after that and keep.
It's not like going to mommy after you went
Right.
to dad.
Exactly. That's the rules of the system. Okay. Once you ask a shaila, right, you can choose whether to ask a shaila or not. You can choose who to ask the shaila of. But once you ask the shaila, you are bound by it. Okay. At least morally, and some would say by the rules of God, right? Which is why I'm careful when people ask me.
Usually do this.
Right. When people ask me halachic questions, I try and be very. I mean, are you asking me for information, or are you asking me for a ruling? Because if you want information, I'll give you information. If you're asking me for a ruling, you are morally bound to follow it.
Are these rulings written down anywhere?
Yeah, there's tons and tons of.
My God, my goodness, how many volumes would you have?
Oh, endless volumes of responsa. Endless volumes of responsa. Yeah. Although nowadays, right, it's all cataloged on the Bar Ilan responsa database.
And so it is centralized.
Yeah. Well,
within.
I mean, having said that, look, there's stuff out there that hasn't been cataloged. I mean, like, for example, this isn't responsa literature, but this is the Cairo Geniza, right? But similarly, so the Cairo Geniza, which was discovered well over 100 years ago, right, and all of the material is in Cambridge University, it's still not fully cataloged, okay? And I had a cousin, he passed away a few years ago, but he was the world's greatest expert in this particularly narrow area of Jewish literature. And every 7 years, he would get a sabbatical, he would go off to Cambridge, and he would find another document that had never been published before and publish a critical edition and another book, right? Which probably 10 people in the world have bought, right? But academic book can be over that. And that's, so I'm sure, I know people are still finding responsa that may have been written by somebody, generations ago.
All right, so why would you go to Rabbis Dorff and Rosenzweig if you have these volumes of responses? Why can't you find something that's pretty much on all fours with the question?
Because circumstances change, and what was the correct answer in 19th century Poland is not necessarily the correct answer in 21st century Maryland.
Dred Scott.
Right.
Yeah.
So that, you know, as well as the fact that there are questions. I mean, Jewish law works by analogy, right? But having said that, I mean, there are certain answers. I mean, like for example, right? I mean, the ubiquity of voice-activated stuff these days, right? Now, right? So now, we in conservative Judaism permit you to use electricity on Shabbat, right? So I have no problem listening to the radio on Shabbat anyway. But having said that, I don't have a radio in my house that's not voice activated, right? I mean, could somebody who doesn't use electricity on Shabbat listen to the radio by means of voice activation? I don't know. I mean, I can't answer that because it's not my frame of reference, but I also can't answer it because I don't understand the technology well enough, right? So that's another reason why you would go to somebody who's learning you respect rather than trying to, you know, research it on your own. All right, so we have responsive literature, and then we also have codes. Okay, and codes are exactly what they say.
CODES.
Yeah. I mean, and there are even conservative codes. I mean, there's a book called The Observant Life, which came out a few years ago. Before that, there was Isaac Klein's Guide to Jewish Religious Practices. But, you know, all these art scroll books, right? I'm not talking about the Sidurim, but if you have, you know, the Art Scroll Guide to Shabbat, Art Scroll Guide to Keeping Kosher, that's a code, right? Now, some of them are really comprehensive codes that, you know, all of life from A to Z. Others is a code about one narrow area, but that's a code, right? And you pick it up, and it tells you what to do.
And so that's based on the Mishnah.
It's based on the Mishnah, the Gemara, the Responsa. You know, the same way that, you know. Yeah, right. I mean, the same way that I suppose a lawyer would do. I mean, if you were doing, I don't know, a complete guide to contractual law in Maryland.
Oh, like a black letter law is what we call them.
Yeah. Right, exactly.
Yes, that, I understand.
Yeah.
So the code would be like, I found this interesting thing for Pesach. It tells you exactly how much of whatever it is you have to eat to be.
We call those a horn book, and then the code typically is something that would be
right.
done by a
Right. Yeah. So the terminology is a little different.
But I gotta ask a question.
Okay, go ahead.
So Gail says in one of these codes, in one of these books, she saw what the sages said about how much matzah you have to eat at this or that part of the Seder, which is true. That exists. And I question it. Your answer is you have to buy into the system, and then you accept the answers the system burps out. I have a lot of difficulty with that. I really appreciate what the sages did for us so that we're not killing goats. And so I buy into ritual as an alternative because they offered it and it's there and we do it. But I don't take it as requirements. I take it as an offering, the same way that when they capital T, say you have to eat an ounce and a half of matzah at this point in the Seder, I don't take that as a requirement, but as it's more than a suggestion.
It's a guide.
It's a guide, but it's not I don't feel bound.
Right, I get it, and I haven't gotten there yet. Okay,
Great,
So-
then I'll be
He's not
quiet.
bound yet.
right. No, I mean, look, that's the key problem, right? I mean, that is
To me it is. I don't know, I didn't know that it
no,
was to you.
I say it is the key problem. Look, I
You
mean,
switched from being reformed to conservative just to get at halacha to let it
Right.
guide you.
right, but look, the reality is, and this is why I'm very careful about, answering shilas. I'm under no illusion that most of the members of our congregation are halakhically observant. I'm under no illusion, right? And so,
Well, most of, without question, you can be absolutely sure that 100% of your congregation is 99.99% ignorant of halacha. And our religion allows that. Our religion says you're only responsible for what you know. Ignorance is
right, but you're also responsible to learn, right? You're
And then when
also
you ask the question, then you're.
if you ask the question, but I'm
Right.
saying, but most of what we don't know the
Right.
wisdom behind it.
right, exactly. And I would say that the rabbis have done a very poor job of teaching it. I mean, that's why that's why I view my role as a teacher. In other words, look, you can buy in or not buy in, but you have no excuse for not knowing.
The whole thing?
Not the content, not the entire content, but you have no excuse for not knowing what halacha is and how the system works, I
For
think,
sure.
right? I mean,
Sure.
all right, so I'm going to go on. Okay, so I want to look at two different Orthodox views of halacha, even though obviously, neither one is what I believe, nor presumably, but what most of you believe. But it's telling. Okay, so the moderate Orthodox view is that God revealed the Torah, and with it certain rules of interpretation, right? How and when I say Torah, I don't just mean the written Pentateuch, right? And the rules are, in other words, the rules of the halachic system, right? How we arrive at decisions. God revealed the Torah, and God revealed the rules of the system, right? And then God gave the power to the rabbis of each generation to apply and interpret in accordance with those rules and the needs of the community. God wills us to follow those rabbis, but does not guarantee that their decisions are in some platonic sense correct, right? In other words, it's more the rabbis have the authority, and as long as the rabbis are acting in good faith according to the rules, then you should follow them. And that is certainly the case. In other words, if you come to me with a shaila, right? And it's a shaila. And a shaila means a question, she'elah. Okay, but a she'elah meaning what is the law? What must I do? Right? And I get that. Okay, I don't get that frequently, but I do get it. Okay? Now, if you come to me and you're really asking me to rule on a matter of law, and you intend to follow the ruling I give you, and I rule incorrectly, that's on me. It's not on you.
But you did it in good faith.
Right. Right. But you have the right to follow my rulings, even if my rulings are in some certain platonic sense incorrect. Okay.
But if you know they're incorrect, then you don't follow them, right?
I don't know. It depends on what you mean by know they're incorrect.
If I become aware that your ruling that the murder is all right is not correct, I believe that since I know that that's just not correct, from however I know.
All right,
that,
I'm talking more in terms of, ritual
I
matters.
understand.
Okay, like if you came to me with certain product, right? And I hold, as I do hold, that you can eat things based on their ingredients, right? Even if it doesn't have a hechsher, if the ingredients are okay. You come to me and you give me the box and you say, and I say, yeah, it's okay. And it turns out that I'm wrong because I don't know that one of these ides or ites is. Okay, and so I've told you that you can eat it, right? And you're not responsible for having eaten treif. I'm responsible for having. Now, should you discover that, and if I'm constantly giving you bad information, then maybe you need another rabbi, right? Or I need another job, or both. But you are entitled to act on what I tell you, provided that, we're both acting in good faith. Okay?
Isn't it hard? And how do you know that the answer's not correct? Who finds out?
Well, no, because look, there are certain things that are objectively the case. In other words, Mike brings me, a package, and I say, oh yeah, that's fine, right? And it turns out that one of these ingredients, right, that is, has some long scientific name, is nothing but concentrated pig's blood, right? Now, that's not. Look, there are certain things that are subject to debate. Gelatin is subject to debate. Rennet is subject to debate.
Really?
Carmine is subject to debate. Concentrated pig's blood is not subject to debate, right? And so, if Mike became aware that, this actually pig's blood in it, that's a problem. That's what I'm saying, okay?
And
But
the reason
possibly that the rabbi finds that he's wrong.
Sure.
You hope he'll admit it.
Absolutely. Right.
The most glaring, one of the most glaring of these kinds of questions. So you have anti-cheeseburger law in the Torah. You shouldn't seethe a kid in its mother's milk. Punto. Right? And you have the concept that there should be fences around fences. So
right.
To make sure you're not screwing up by accident, the rabbis say, so you shouldn't have any meat cooked in milk, any milk, not just a relative. That makes sense if you want to do what the Torah says. That's a smart fence, okay, just to play safe. And then the rabbis say,
all right, but that's not
meat or chicken.
Right, but that's not the area. I'm talking about really sort of factual mistakes.
So, like.
All right, so let's move on because
Okay.
you're taking us in a different
Okay,
generation.
go ahead.
All right, so whereas the right-wing Orthodox view is that God revealed the Torah and God guides the deliberations of the sages in every age, so that it's literally God's will. In other words, God makes sure that the greatest sages of the generation don't make mistakes, right? Whereas modern Orthodox say, yeah, they could make mistakes. They could make mistakes. They're only human, right? But as a pragmatic level, this is what we have. Okay, so now, why observe halacha, right? So the Orthodox answer is that it's the will of God, right? Now, there are variations and subtleties as to how exactly that works, but overall, this is the case, right? And if you go to, a Keruv rabbi, a rabbi whose function is to convince you to become more observant, right? And the two biggest flavors of Keruv are Chabad and Aish, right? If you go to a Chabad or an Aish rabbi and you ask, well, why should I keep kosher? I mean, they may give you all kinds of songs and dances, right? But the bottom line answer is God said so, right? And anything else is just sort of, elaboration or propaganda, right? God said so. And that's why, you should observe halacha, because God said so, right? And, obviously most Jews don't believe that, right? I mean, again, I would posit that it makes no sense for somebody to say, I firmly believe that God wants me to keep kosher, nevertheless I choose not to. Right? Right. I mean, people who don't keep kosher because they don't believe God said so.
That's right.
People who don't observe Shabbat because they don't believe God said so. People who don't put on tefillin because they don't believe God said so. If you believed God said so, you would do it.
So we had this discussion at your very first class, and you said my position is untenable. My position is that you can believe those things of God and be non-observant.
All right, I'm going to actually get to somebody who said something similar. Okay, I may get to. No. All right. So that's the Orthodox answer. The Reform answer is the autonomous Jewish self. Right? The autonomous Jewish self, in no sense is halacha considered binding. Right? It may be good advice, it may be one, but it's not binding. Right? Conservative Judaism asserts that halacha is binding, but we have various approaches to both the content and the nature of the binding authority, and also a high tolerance for non-observance. Okay, in other words, there are Orthodox shuls, and I think as Orthodoxy moves to the right, they wouldn't let you daven from the Amud if they knew you weren't Shomer Shabbos, right? They might not even give you an aliyah if they knew you weren't Shomer Shabbos, right? I mean, if we tried to live under those assumptions, we would have no shul. Right, we would have no shul, right? If we said the only people who can lead services are people who observe Shabbat, who would we have, right? The only people who can have aliyahs are people who observe Shabbat. Who could get an aliyah? We tolerate non-observance, right? We don't valorize it or validate it, but we tolerate it, right? Now. All right, so Rosenzweig. Here is, I think what you're saying could fit into the Rosenzweig view. Franz Rosenzweig, who I spoke about a couple of classes ago. Buber's body, right? So Rosenzweig talked about, and I don't know German, but Gesetz and Gebot, which meant legislation and command. Okay, in other words, there's the legislation. It's on the books, right? All of it is in theory binding. Command is it speaks to me. It speaks to me. The other ones, they don't speak to me. They might speak to me at a certain point, right? Like you presumably would not say that eating only kosher slaughtered meat is dumb. You say, it doesn't speak to me, and I choose not to do it. But I don't deny that the legislation exists, right? And I might do it at some point in the future if the circumstances spoke to me, something like that. Is that?
No, I mean, if we're in that example, where the rules, if you're talking about rules of slaughter for kashrut, are not in the Torah, but there's a line in there that says, as God said, or something.
Right.
So we don't have that. What did God actually say in terms of the way to properly kosherly slaughter an animal?
Sure we do. the whole tractate of Hulin.
That's he said, she said. That's what the sages, and this gets to it. I mean, either you say that God, if one of those sages were sitting here and he said, this is how you do it, and you said, how do you know? And he said, God told me.
No, but God didn't tell him.
Told Moses.
His rabbi told him, whose rabbi told him, whose rabbi told him, whose rabbi told him, whose rabbi told him, all the way back to Moses.
So pick your place. I'll give you Moses and Joshua. Pick your place, and beyond. I mean, Moses had direct contact, but it hasn't happened for all the sages. It hasn't happened. So when this Orthodox or that says, but it's the will of God that you do this. That's a heavy-duty statement.
Sure it is.
The difference between being a binding statement, which I would take to be the legislative, and a serious guide, which I would take to be the command.
Right.
That's how I would see it. And I have no problem with the serious commands, because that's what they are urging, and with a basic belief handed down from generation.
Right.
My problem is just with the legislative part that says, I know it's right because God told me. Not me, but my uncle or my grandfather or whatever. That's a heavier duty.
Sure it is. Sure it is. And you essentially you either buy into the system or you don't. My response is that not buying into the system leaves us adrift. Having said that,
I agree.
Having said that, I also can accept, look, I'm not 100% halakhically observant either. Okay, there are things that speak to me more and there are things that speak to me less. Okay, but I don't posit that because it doesn't speak to me, it's right for me not to do it. I mean, when I don't do certain things, I kind of think I really should be, but I just don't because my existential situation does, so I'm Rosenzweig in that sense too. Right, but I think that if you want to figure out how to make decisions Jewishly and not just on a whim, right, the halacha is the place where that takes place. And that's why, and I recognize that at times I am operating in one sphere and the whole rest of the shul is operating in another sphere, right? And it's especially so because, look, I've been here now almost 8 years. You know me. You know that I'm fairly lenient, right? My approach to halachic decision-making is fairly lenient. I don't like to put my foot down, right? So on those occasions when I do put my foot down, it's, like this question of interfaith burial in our section of the cemetery, so I'm sorry, that's just not allowed, okay? And arguments from compassion and arguments from practicality and arguments from fiscal prudence carry no weight because the halacha is clear.
And there's other people involved.
Right, it totally.
Right.
If you come up with an example of where it's between you and God, no other people are involved, and the sages opine this,
Right.
and you find that to be interesting, but that's a good way to put it.
He did that.
Yeah.
Then were it me, I would not find myself as constricted as with the cemetery issue, which involves people who are already buried there.
Right, sure.
Whose families buried
Yeah,
them
you
on
got
certain
the
set of
contract.
circumstances.
What about once you get into the moral authority? We had that presentation yesterday from the Jews for AOC, and they said Jews united for justice, with the implication being there's
Right.
a Jewish justice.
Right.
Where are we on that for the Holocaust?
Well, all right,
Or
so-
did we even get there?
All right. No, look, I mean, I would say not every legislative question has a halachic answer. Okay? In other words,
Right.
now some do. Okay? Like, as far as I'm concerned, the way capital punishment is carried out in this country
Right.
is simply contrary to halacha.
Right.
And I poskin, I rule that no Jew may be a part of that system, period. Okay? Does that therefore mean that the United States should abolish capital punishment?
Yes, it does.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I feel that way. I'm less comfortable saying that my ruling as a rabbi is that we must eliminate it. Similarly, I believe that physician-assisted suicide is contrary to halacha. Okay? Am I about to start excommunicating half of the Jewish members of the legislature? No. Because they differ, and
Right.
so I think that the halacha gives us a geist, if you will, but it's not a guide to legislation, right? In other words, I mean, let's look at access to health care,
Okay.
right? I think it's very clear to me that the halacha says that the community has an obligation to make sure that everybody has health care.
Okay.
Okay, how do we do that? Whether it's through Medicare for all or some hybrid system or whatever, that's not a halachic issue. That is an issue for the experts to figure out. And I can have my opinion as much as anybody else, but it's just my opinion. It's not a halachic perspective.
Eradicating poverty. The divide, the divide between rich and poor, inequality.
Right.
So there's some tradition for that, and the thought would be to try to
minimize
the idea
right.
of making sure people have clothing and food and so forth. The amount and the wherewithal is another issue.
Correct.
Completely. Yeah.
Right. I mean, it's also
tradition. Yeah.
I mean, it is also complicated, honestly, by the fact that citizenship as we know it is not a category that historically has existed in Jewish law, right? I mean, and that's why I say I hesitate to say that the United States must eliminate capital punishment. I mean, I feel that way as an American, not necessarily as a rabbi, right? Because, historically, it's either been a halachic commonwealth where the non-Jews were guests, or we've been guests, right? And nobody cares what we think, right? No czar ever said, go poll the Jews and see how they think about this issue.
They don't poll them, but they did have advisors
Sure.
who were respected.
Sure.
And if you as a respected advisor said, sorry, here's the problem with this capital punishment. It's arbitrary. It doesn't work. It doesn't stop. That kind of stuff. His army come up on his own and say, you know what, let's just stop this.
Right. Right. But what I'm saying is that if the federal government puts somebody to death,
Right.
they are doing so in my name.
That's correct.
When the czar puts somebody to death, He was not doing it in my
No,
Zadie's
he was doing it in
name.
his
That's
own
the
name.
difference.
Yeah.
That's the difference. Okay, and that's a big difference. So that, I mean, the tragedy that we have is that by and large, the people who take citizenship seriously don't take halacha seriously. And the people who take halacha seriously don't take citizenship seriously. By and large. By and large. I mean, if you have, I mean, the Haredi community, by and large, has no problem committing massive welfare fraud,
Sure.
right? Because they don't really, it's all transactional, right? They don't
Right.
take citizenship seriously, right? It's all transactional. And if you can get away with it, great,
Right.
right? But whereas we would say, no, it's wrong. It is wrong. Whereas I don't think cheating the czar out of taxes was wrong.
But that gets back to your, and you've given this lecture a few times in your talks. Are you an American Jew or a Jewish American?
Right. And I would say the answer has to be both,
Right.
actually. Right. But that's not a universally accepted answer. Okay. So
But you asked, the moral authority in Judaism for social justice.
Yeah, right. Exactly right.
Poverty, the gap, the rich, poor gap. It does speak to that because, and I'm not, Rabbi, you can help on that. I don't remember it well enough, but when we say to the ahavta, and it's the cholavot, with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your, it's translated resources,
right.
does not mean elsewhere when that comes up, they don't use that word just because you're not required to give away all your money to tzedakah.
No, not all. Certainly not.
Yeah, and so it takes the position that gap that exists, that there are rich people and poor people, and it doesn't speak to that as immoral in
No, but the flip
making
side,
you solve the problem.
right? No, but the flip side is if you look at the land legislation of the Torah, it does aim to minimize inequality, right? I mean, so having to give it back in 50 years, that was originally allocated by lot, that people always maintain the right to reclaim their ancestral holdings. In other words, I mean, I think that, look, you cannot translate 3,000-year-old legislation neatly into contemporary terms, right? But I would say that, if I had to, I would say that it is sort of liberally guided capitalism. That is to say, right, that people have the right to ownership, people have the right to enterprise, people have the right to benefit from their own intelligence, their own drive, even their own luck, but to a certain point, right? The kind of, I mean, the idea that people literally have to choose between medicine and food,
Right.
Oh, roof over their head.
right?
Yeah.
That's obscene, and there's nothing in Judaism that can justify that. Now, how do we resolve that? There we can argue about what is the best way to resolve that. But the fact that we have to resolve it, that's
I mean, we
indisputable.
all agree, but what would you point to where the in the Mishnah that says that it would be wrong for somebody, I mean, I don't know if it's that specific, to have to choose. He has a limited amount of money and he has to decide whether to eat or sleep or
Or
whatever.
clothing.
Well, then the community has to provide for them, and this is all codified.
And that's
The
clear.
obligation,
It's in Torah. I mean,
right?
it's
The
very
obligation of the community to provide for at least the basic subsistence needs of every member of the
Right.
community.
Because it keeps repeating of the poor, of the
And
stranger.
the
Right.
widow and the orphan.
Yeah,
routine.
it's over and over in the.
Right. I mean, the greater challenge is the halachic challenge is the definition of community. Right. In other words,
The Jews that were protected.
Is it your house, your family?
And
Jews.
right. But also, does the community extend to my non-Jewish neighbors?
Right, that's where we go. It's question.
Right. And I would say yes. But it's a harder halachic case to build. Frankly, I don't want to get delayed. Okay. So.
Curious rabbit trails here.
Yeah. Well, look, I mean, there's a lot of stuff,
Oh,
know,
yeah.
and you guys are asking good questions. But, all right, so I want to look at some halachic theories. I had, I'm going to skip some of this stuff. All right, so some selected halachic theories. In other words, how it's supposed to work. Solomon Schechter, right, who is sort of, at least mythically, the founding father of the institutions of conservative Judaism in this country, right? He actually rejected critical scholarship of the Bible, right? He would not allow the documentary hypothesis, et cetera, to be taught at JTS when he was the head of JTS. But he accepted it for rabbinic literature, okay, because there's also, varying manuscripts and so on and so forth. And of course, he made his name with the Cairo Geniza, right? So obviously, his expertise is, different manuscripts of halachic works, etc. Okay, but he said that the determination of halacha was the province not only of the sages, but also of what he called Catholic Israel. Catholic Israel was his translation for what we call Klal Yisrael. Okay, Klal Yisrael means like the community of Israel. Okay, so that Torah has two meanings: what it originally meant, and that developed by the rabbis, and the collective conscience of Catholic Israel embodied in the universal synagogue. Right? In other words, what he's saying is that basically the Jewish people determines practice, not simply a bunch of rabbis in an ivory tower, right? And we have countless examples of that. I'll give you two. Okay, if you look at art scroll type guides to observing Shabbat, you will find that eating fish on Shabbat is strictly forbidden because of the malacha, the category of labor of borer, sifting. Because you're taking the bones out of the fish, that is separating the chaff from the wheat. It is strictly forbidden. Okay, the problem is, it is a simple fact that Jews have been eating fish on Shabbat for thousands of years, right? So you can rule whatever you want to rule. Bobby says that we eat fish on Shabbos, right? And I'm not talking, and of course this is assuming that Bubby was observant, right? Which until 100 years ago was true, for sure, right? I mean, the fact that, so there's been this disruption, and we can't always now depend on family tradition to know what's proper practice, but you could 100 years ago or 120 years ago when Schechter was writing. Okay, so that's one example. Another example, I heard this from Professor Chaim Soloveitchik, who is the son of the late Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik. And he was talking exactly about how Klal Yisrael shapes practice. And he said there was a time when his mother had had a heart attack and she was in the hospital, and so he and his father were maintaining the kitchen. He said, and when my mother got out of the hospital and came home and saw what we were doing, she almost had another heart attack. Okay, now in this case, because the universal practice of Jewish women is actually much stricter than black letter law, right? I mean, if you ask me, Rabbi, do I really have to have a meat dish rag and a dairy dish rag? You do not. Having said that, it was the universal practice to have
The blue cake of soap and the red cake of soap.
all of which,
drying
all of which is strictly speaking not necessary at all, but it's what everybody did, right? So that's
what the
also,
women did,
right?
And the men were never paid attention to it anyway.
Right.
So Bubby, it's not that she was observant; it's that her piece of the elephant that she got to touch was making sure the kitchen was run the way her Bubby did.
Exactly, and that's the way you learned how to do it. I think I sent you this article, right? Rupture and Reconstruction. Did I? I think I did. Okay. Where Chaim Soloveitchik says that what I will call the art scroll phenomenon is precisely because of the rupture in that chain of tradition, right? You learned how to do Jewish by observing your parents doing Jewish, right? But that's no longer the case. Like, for example, right, every time we have a Sunday minyan during Hol HaMoed, right, people ask me, tefillin or no tefillin, right? Now, the proper halachic answer is follow your father's practice, right? And then my sort of jocular answer is my father doesn't wear tefillin on Hol HaMoed, so I don't either.
Does.
But my father never wears tefillin,
Yeah, I didn't.
right? I mean, now, my father probably learned about tefillin from his father. I didn't learn about tefillin from my father. I learned about it from some guy at the Western Wall, right? Which is also why I feel justified in not wearing them on Hol HaMoed, because I started putting on tefillin in Israel, and in Israel you don't, right? But the point is, you can't simply say follow your family's practice, right? Because that chain of tradition has often, not always, but often been cut either by secularization or the Holocaust. And thus the art, or both, right? And thus art scroll, right? So you learn how to do it from a book, not from.
That's the problem with this oral tradition. I mean, that's what they say, an oral contract isn't worth the paper it's written on. Well,
right.
But it's that idea, and there's going to be gaps.
Sure.
I mean, and you have this tradition. You don't cross-examine. You don't go to alternative sources, and you don't have to be obsessive as a lawyer. But on the other hand, by having those tools available to you, you can test them. And a lot of these things come down untested.
Right. All right, we're going to break here. So
Great.
thank you very much.
Thank you. That's actually pretty interesting, right? I was prepared to look the Deuteronomy or whatever.